We all get carried away with our website visuals. You know, the colors, the layouts, the animations, the transitions, and all of that good stuff. And yeah, that is important. Presentation is very important. But here comes the big question. If we turn all that off today, does your website still make sense? In this module, we are going to focus on semantic HTML. That is what tells the browsers and assistive technology what your website is all about, not the fancy decorations. So let's dive right in. Here's a quick look at the demo site we'll be using for the rest of this course. This is not the final version. We'll be making changes as we go along. And I'll try to leave links to every resource we use for each module in the accompanying article. Today's video is focused on semantic HTML and not styling, so you can ignore some of the styles that you see on the screen. We're focusing on the HTML content for this section of the course. So now, what do we mean by semantic HTML? Semantic HTML simply means HTML that carry meaning. So for example, we have a paragraph of content. How do we represent that paragraph of content in HTML? We use a P element. So a P element represents a full paragraph of content. Then when we have different content and we're trying to break up that content into a meaningful structure, we can now use a topic for that content, and that topic is the heading. We use the heading element to designate the topic for a section of content. And for the topics, we designate them as H1 to H6, and they have to be in order. The H1 usually represents your primary title that encapsulates the entire page. And then after that, for each section of content, we use H2s and then subsections, H3s, and so on. And speaking of section, a section is simply a thematic grouping of content where that whole group of content have a similar theme. So for example, we have one group of content called the Our Story group of content, and the heading basically explains what content follows underneath it. So we have Our Story. It tells us about the actual story of the Copper Fox restaurant. Then you see another new group of content, which is Our Menu as the heading, and it tells us about all of the menu that are offered in that restaurant. So we have starters, we have mains, and we have desserts. Those are all of the different menus that are offered in the restaurant. So we have another section that is dealing with seasonal specials. So you see, we have a thematic group of content. So we're now designated that with a section element. So now, one thing I would like you to do as an exercise is take any website, preferably your own website, and we're going to be doing a test on the website. So using any of the popular browsers like Chrome, Edge, Firefox, or Safari, go into your settings and search for reading mode. For example, with Chrome, I'll click on the three dots. I'll look for the More Tools and then look for reading mode. So that will now show you the HTML content of your site without all of the fluff, all of the styling, all of the animation and so on. It just gives you the HTML content. So you can now go through that content and see if your site makes sense. If it doesn't, then you know that some things need to be updated. Now, this is not an exhaustive look because the reading mode tends to strip out a lot of content like any links, buttons, images, and so on. But at least it gives you a good understanding of your content for you to see how somebody who is in reader mode will explore your content. And it follows how a screen reader user might also interact with your content. The other tool that I would like you to try out is a Chrome extension, and it's called the HeadingsMap. It is free, and what that does is it shows you an outline of all of the headings that you have on your page. So you can now look at that outline of headings. It should mimic how we have with our physical books as well, where we have a table of contents that tells us exactly where we can jump to learn about different topics. It should be sequential, it should be in order. So first we have the H1, which is the primary heading of the page or the title of the page. Then we have each section for like our story, our menu, we have the seasonal specials and so on. So those are different sections on our page, and they give us an overview of the sections. And then if there are any subsections, for example, in our menu, we have starters, mains, and dessert. Within the starters, we have the different starters that are available and so on. So they should make sense in the sequential order. Don't have an H1 that jumps to an H4, then an H2, then an H3. That is not recommended. And you should know that as a bonus point, this is really helpful for screen reader users, because screen reader users mostly rely on the headings to quickly get an overview of your page. So now that we've seen these two tools, then let's talk about documents you can use to understand HTML better. So the two documents I would recommend are the HTML Living Standard, which is considered as the single source of truth for semantic HTML. I recommend that you use the multi-page version so that it is faster to browse through. And where you just go to is the elements of HTML, and it will show you all of the HTML elements and explain to you the different examples of when you can use those elements. So it's a good starting point to learn about HTML. Then if you want to get further information about each element, you can use the MDN docs. It's very good. It gives you a more user-friendly, readable version of the Living Standard. Just as we recommend using a design tool to create your designs like Figma, I also recommend using a Markdown editor tool to create your content so that you can visually see the flow of content and make adjustments where needed before putting it into your visual development environment. So now let's see what I mean. I used an online tool called Markdown Viewer to present my design into a text format. So you can do that too. That gives you a better idea of the flow of content. So now we can now use the design and the text in the builder. So I'll jump to my WordPress dashboard. And in the last episode, I told you to go to Builderius and then Home and choose your starting point. I chose standard settings in the last episode, so we can continue from there. So head over to Pages and create a new page. So I'll create a page. I'll give it a title of Home, because that's going to be for the home page. I'll publish it. Then I'll go back to the dashboard and then head over to Settings and Reading. And I will change my home page settings to a static page and choose the home page that I just created. So now that we've designated the home page, let's go back to Pages, and I can now go ahead and edit the page with Builderius. And for this lesson, we are focusing on the main content area. In a future episode, we'll learn more about the page layout for the header, the main, the footer. But in today's lesson, we're just focusing on the main content area. So I'll go ahead and I'll delete the header, and I'll remove the footer, and I'll just stick to the main content area. So now within this main content area, we'll now start adding our content that are specific to the current page. So we're starting from the hero section. So now we have our hero section. We've decided that this is going to be one section, and it just has the heading and a paragraph. As we can see from our text content, we have the heading and the paragraph. So let's go ahead and represent that. I'll go back to the builder, and we'll go to the element inserter, and we'll look under the layout header for our section. So now I've added a section of content to my page. We can go ahead and rename the section element. So I'll go to the section and I can click within the element settings, and there I can rename it. So this is the hero section. So for the hero section, I'm just going to add those two elements, which is the heading and the paragraph. So inside of the container, I'll add the heading element. So under the text content, I'll hold the shift key so I can add multiple elements. So the heading, and the paragraph. Then I'll go ahead and populate them with content. So I'll go back to my content, copy, and then I'll paste. I'll do the same for the tagline, and then I'll paste it. So we have our first section of content. Now, there's one HTML element that we'll discuss today. You have to read it on your own and decide if that HTML element is right for your use case. So now let's go over to the HTML Living Standard. And first we'll talk about the headings. You can go ahead and read more about headings. And the element that we're going to be focusing on today is the hgroup element. Let's go ahead and read through what the document says about the element. It says the hgroup element represents a heading and related content. The element may be used to group an H1 to H6 element with one or more P elements containing content representing a subheading, alternative title, or a tagline. So I think that constitutes what we're doing in this case. For example, you can see hgroup, it has an H1 and a paragraph element, and that just constitutes the heading of the page. So we can now represent that as an hgroup. One thing to note, though, is that semantic HTML doesn't automatically translate to accessible HTML. What I mean by that is, just because we're using an hgroup element doesn't mean that it has some special meaning to some assistive technologies. It might just be represented as a generic container to assistive technologies, but at least it gives a better structure to our page, especially for search engines. Okay, so now let's go back to the page, and we can now convert our div container because it's only the heading and the paragraph, nothing else follows with this content. So we can now convert that div container into an hgroup element. So if you have the pro version of Builderius, I can just search for hgroup, and if it doesn't exist, it will create it for me. So now we have an hgroup element that wraps our heading and our paragraph. Okay, so that's it for the first section of content. We have the heading and the paragraph, but remember to actually set the heading level. So we'll come back. If you go into our heading, since this is the main topic of the page, we need to make sure that we put it as an H1. So change the HTML heading level to H1. And we can go ahead and save the page, and we're done. Next, we create our new section. So I'll click on the main container again. And rather than go to the element inserter, I can just look on the right-hand side of my screen at the quick action toolbar and just click on the section element. That creates a new section of content for us, and I'm going to populate that with my next set of content. For that set of content, let's go to the design. We now have two subgroups of content. We have one subgroup for our text content and another subgroup for our image. So what is the best HTML element that can be used to just group heading and a paragraph of text? There isn't really any HTML element for now, so we're just going to use a generic div because we're just going to be using it for styling purposes only. There's no semantic reason why we are grouping the content because we already have a main group called the section group. There's no need to now group the section of content again within the group. So what we just do is use a set of divs. So I'll use two divs. Holding down my shift key, I just click the div twice. One div is for the content, so I can rename that to the content div. And the other is going to be for our media or image. So I'll say that's the media div, just so that we can understand what is going on. So within the content div, we'll go ahead and add our content, which is our story as the heading, and a set of paragraphs. I think about 3 paragraphs. So let's go ahead and just quickly copy all of the content, and then we'll go back into the builder and see how it is done. So first we have the content div. We'll add in the heading, and we'll add about 3 paragraph elements. The heading, I'll go ahead and populate it with content. It is called our story. And make sure the heading level is correct, H2. Then I'll also populate the paragraph content. So let's just go ahead and copy the elements and drop them in. So now we have our set of content. We can now go ahead and in the next lesson, learn about images. So in this lesson, we've learned the basics of HTML. We've seen some resources we can use to learn more about HTML. We've learned about section elements, the heading, and the paragraphs. In the next lesson, we'll learn about the images and media content.